21 miles, that's it. That's the width of the most dangerous stretch of water on the planet right now. 21 miles of ocean separating the Persian Gulf from the rest of the world, and whoever controls those 21 miles controls the energy lifeline of the entire global economy. Right now, in April 2026, that lifeline is being strangled. Roughly 20% of the world's oil and natural gas normally passes through the Strait of Hormuz. Wikipedia. Every barrel coming out of Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait, Iraq, it all has to squeeze through this single narrow corridor. There is no plan B. There is no alternative route. It's this or nothing. And right now, it's basically nothing. The restriction of shipments through the strait by more than 90%, around 10 million barrels per day, has raised energy and agricultural input costs worldwide. Wikipedia ships are sitting trapped, tankers are waiting, fuel prices are spiking, and two of the most powerful militaries on Earth are staring each other down in one of the most confined, explosive military situations the modern world has ever seen. So how did we get here? Because I promise you, this didn't happen overnight. This is the result of decades of mistrust, failed diplomacy, nuclear brinksmanship, and a set of decisions made in February and March of 2026 that nobody can take back now. Let's go through it properly, every single piece of it. The story of this war really begins with a nuclear deal that died years ago. Back in 2015, Iran and the United States, along with several other world powers, signed the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA. It was designed to limit Iran's nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief. Iran complied with the terms. The international inspectors confirmed it. And then in 2018, Trump walked away from it, just pulled the US out completely, reimposed every sanction, and adopted what his team called a maximum pressure strategy. Basically, squeeze Iran economically until it breaks or comes back to the table with nothing left to negotiate. The Biden administration kept most of these sanctions in place, further damaging Iran's economy. Trump continued the maximum pressure approach in his second term. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent labeled the collapse of the Iranian currency in December 2025 as the strategy's grand culmination. Wikipedia: Iran's economy was in freefall. Its currency had collapsed. Protests had broken out across the country in late December 2025, and its regional allies, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, had been severely weakened by years of Israeli military operations. Iran's posture was in a weakened state after years of sanctions, recent destabilizing protests, damage inflicted during the 12-day war with Israel in June 2025, and the diminished position of Iran's allies. Encyclopedia Britannica. And yet, Iran still had its nuclear program, still had its enriched uranium stockpile, still had hundreds of ballistic missiles, and that, for Washington and Tel Aviv, was the unfinished business. So in early 2026, talks began. One final attempt at diplomacy before something much worse. The first round of talks took place on February 6th in Muscat, Oman, with U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner representing the United States, and Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi representing Iran. Notably, the United States also included U.S. Central Command Commander Admiral Brad Cooper, a visual reminder that the USS Lincoln was offshore. Center for Strategic and International Studies. Think about that detail for a second. The Americans brought the commander of their entire regional military force into a diplomatic meeting. That's not subtle. That's a message. That's Washington saying, we are talking to you right now, but we are also very much ready to stop talking. Araghchi drew a hard line on the scope of negotiations, insisting the topic of talks should consist of solely the nuclear issue, while President Trump maintained any deal must cover no nuclear weapons, no missiles, no this, no that. Center for Strategic and International Studies. Right from day one, the two sides weren't even agreeing on what they were negotiating about. Iran wanted to talk about nukes only. America wanted to talk about nukes, missiles, proxies, Hezbollah, Hamas, everything. That fundamental disagreement never got resolved. Not in round one, not in round two, not ever. The second round of talks occurred on February 17th in Geneva and concluded with both sides agreeing to draft deals. Center for Strategic and International Studies. On the surface, that sounded like progress, and there was even a headline-grabbing moment Oman announced that Iran had agreed to never stockpile enriched uranium, calling it a major breakthrough that has never been achieved. But read the fine print and you'll immediately see the problem. Adequate compliance on stockpiling almost certainly meant different things to each party. Iranian representatives previously proposed only to dilute its highly enriched uranium in-country, while the United States' view required that all enriched uranium be transferred abroad. Center for Strategic and International Studies diluting it inside Iran versus physically shipping it out of Iran. Those are not the same thing, not even close. One leaves Iran with the capability to re-enrich if it wants to. The other doesn't. And on that single technical distinction, the entire diplomatic effort was quietly dying. The third round of talks convened on February 26th in Geneva, combining indirect Omani negotiations in the morning with an afternoon of direct talks. Center for Strategic and International Studies. 2 days later, while diplomats were still technically at the table, the decision had already been made somewhere else entirely. On February 27th at 3:38 p.m. Eastern Time, Donald Trump, traveling on Air Force One to Corpus Christi, Texas, gave the order to proceed with Operation Epic Fury. Wikipedia. The next morning, the world woke up to war. Mid-morning on February 28th, U.S. and Israeli forces began conducting joint strikes on Iran, numbering nearly 900 in just the first 12 hours. Encyclopedia Britannica. The Israeli Air Force said it had struck 500 military targets in western and central Iran, the largest combat sortie in its history. The operation was codenamed Operation Roaring Lion by Israel. Wikipedia. And within those first chaotic hours, the news came through that nobody had fully expected, even those who knew strikes were coming. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was dead. The opening salvo took out the heart of the Iranian regime, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, along with several of his senior aides, and triggered a torrent of hundreds of retaliatory missiles and thousands of drones from Iran across the Middle East. Encyclopedia Britannica. The man who had controlled Iran's direction for over 3 decades, gone by the end of day 1. Now Washington gave several justifications for why the strikes happened during active negotiations. At his State of the Union address on February 24th, Trump claimed that Iran had restarted its nuclear program and was developing missiles capable of striking the United States. Wikipedia Secretary of State Marco Rubio said the United States was conducting an operation to eliminate the threat of Iran's short-range ballistic missiles and their navy. White House. But here's the part that many observers found deeply unsettling. Although Trump later claimed that he decided to strike Iran after the most recent talks in Geneva, citing intelligence that Iran had secretly resumed work on nuclear projects, various leaks suggest that the final round of negotiations may in fact have been a deliberate decoy, convincing Tehran that the diplomatic track remained active while military preparations were in their final stages. Arab-centered D.C. If that's accurate, it means Iran went into those final Geneva talks thinking there was still a chance for peace, while American bombers were already on the runway. History will argue about that for a long time, but whatever the truth is about how the decision was made, what happened next is not in dispute. Iran struck back, hard, everywhere. Iran, followed by its allies in Iraq and Lebanon, responded with a series of strikes against Israel and U.S. bases and interests across the region, as well as oil and gas production facilities in the Gulf states. Encyclopedia Britannica. The pro-Iran militant group Guardians of the Blood Brigade claimed responsibility for attacks on the U.S. Victory Base near Baghdad International Airport and Erbil. The Islamic Resistance in Iraq claimed responsibility for over 23 drone strikes on U.S. assets in Erbil. Wikipedia, the Royal Air Force Station at Akrotiri, Cyprus was targeted by a drone strike around midnight local time. The U.S. Embassy in Kuwait was struck on March the 2nd and subsequently closed indefinitely. Wikipedia. On March 3rd, U.S. and Israeli strikes reportedly destroyed the Supreme National Security Council headquarters, the Expediency Discernment Council building in Tehran, and what Israeli officials described as an underground nuclear weapons facility. The proximity of these strikes to the Bushehr nuclear power plant, about 12 kilometers away, prompted the Russian agency Rosatom to suspend construction on new facilities there. Wikipedia, the entire region was burning. And the costs were beginning to pile up in ways that were almost impossible to comprehend. As of March 23rd, 13 U.S. service personnel had been officially reported killed in Operation Epic Fury. Israel reported 3 soldiers killed and 16 civilians. France reported 1 soldier killed. At least 4 soldiers in Gulf Cooperation Council countries were reported killed, along with more than 20 civilians. On the other side, there were more than 3,000 fatalities reported in Iran and more than 1,000 in surrounding countries. Congress.gov. And the financial cost? By March 19th, the cost of the war to the U.S. military was estimated at $18 billion, and the Pentagon requested a further $200 billion. By March 31st, the cost to Arab countries was estimated at over $120 billion. The Iranian government assessed the damage to their own economy as at least $300 billion and possibly as much as $1 trillion by April 11th. Wikipedia. But numbers on a page don't capture what was actually happening to real people. And nowhere was that more visible than in the Strait of Hormuz. This is the moment in the story where everything changes, because Iran did something it had threatened before but never done at this scale. It closed the strait. Commercial traffic through the Strait of Hormuz dropped more than 90% after the outbreak of conflict. Iran's attacks on traffic in March caused a further decline. It then selectively approved the transit of some ships, including some Iranian ships, ships belonging to countries that negotiated safe passage, and ships willing to pay Iran a hefty toll. Encyclopedia Britannica. Let me explain what that actually means in practical terms. Every country in Asia that runs on Gulf oil, Japan, South Korea, India, Pakistan, China, suddenly found their supply lines cut. The oil was still in the ground in Saudi Arabia and the UAE. The tankers were still floating in the Persian Gulf, but they couldn't get out. They couldn't move. Major container shipping companies, including Maersk, CMA CGM, and Hapag-Lloyd, suspended transits through the strait and related routes, such as the Red Sea. Wikipedia. The disruptions caused Brent crude prices to jump 10 to 13% in early trading, with analysts warning they could reach $100 per barrel or higher if disruptions persisted. Wikipedia. By early April, the picture inside the Gulf was almost surreal. The Abu Dhabi National Oil Company CEO, Sultan Al Jaber, confirmed that 230 loaded oil tankers were waiting inside the Gulf, unable to move. Wikipedia, 230 ships. Fully loaded with oil the world desperately needed, just sitting there, going nowhere, waiting for 2 governments to stop threatening each other long enough to let them pass. And then Iran added another layer on top of all of this, something that shows you exactly how Iran was thinking strategically. It started charging tolls. If you wanted to pass through the Strait of Hormuz, you paid Iran over $1 million per ship. Since Operation Epic Fury began, only ships that had paid tolls to Iran were able to pass through the strait. Council on Foreign Relations. This was Iran's message to the world. You may have bombed us, you may have killed our supreme leader, you may have destroyed our military infrastructure, but we still control the water, we still have leverage, and you will pay to use it. Washington did not accept that, not even close. Trump repeatedly threatened to destroy Iran's infrastructure if it did not reopen the strait. Wikipedia, the language escalating with every passing week, at one point threatening Iran's entire civilization if a deal wasn't reached. The pressure from global markets, from European allies, from Asian nations facing fuel shortages, it was enormous. And so Pakistan stepped in. Islamabad had been quietly building relationships with both sides throughout the conflict. And Pakistan managed to do something remarkable. It got both sides to agree to a ceasefire. Iran, the US, and Israel agreed to a 2-week ceasefire brokered by Pakistan beginning on April 8th. Wikipedia. For one brief moment, the world exhaled, but almost immediately, the ceasefire began to fray. Iran had initially agreed, as part of the Pakistan-mediated ceasefire plan, to allow a limited number of vessels to transit the Strait of Hormuz daily, but suspended the arrangement after the ceasefire was not implemented in Lebanon and was not extended to Hezbollah and Israel. Iran linked everything to Lebanon. If Israel kept bombing Hezbollah, Iran would keep the strait closed. That was the logic. It was leverage. Iran's way of saying that a ceasefire that only benefits America and Israel is not a real ceasefire at all. And so the Islamabad talks were organized. One final round of negotiations. High stakes, high pressure, Pakistan hosting. J.D. Vance leading the American delegation, Iranian negotiators across the table. The meeting with Iran began early in the morning and lasted throughout the night, close to 20 hours. United against nuclear Iran, 20 hours of talking, and at the end of it, nothing. No deal. Vance's conclusion was blunt. There is only one thing that matters. Iran is unwilling to give up its nuclear ambitions. United against nuclear Iran. Vance told reporters the U.S. officials made very clear what our red lines are, and they have not chosen to accept our terms. Council on Foreign Relations. The sticking point, from the U.S. perspective, was that Iran refused to terminate its nuclear program, relinquish the nearly 1,000 pounds of enriched uranium it had accumulated, and reopen the Strait of Hormuz to all naval traffic without the payment of tolls. Council on Foreign Relations. After the Islamabad talks failed, Trump made his next move. Trump said he no longer cared about negotiations and announced a naval blockade of Iran starting April 13th. Wikipedia. According to U.S. Central Command, only ships entering and leaving Iranian ports would be blockaded, while freedom of navigation would remain for other vessels. Wikipedia. That was the American framing. The strategic logic was straightforward. Cut off Iran's oil revenue, strangle its economy even further, and force it back to the table with no options left. But Iran had a very different interpretation of what this blockade meant. Iran considers the continuation of a U.S. naval blockade as a violation of the ceasefire and has warned it would close the Strait of Hormuz again if the blockade is not lifted. Iran International, Iran's army warned it could block marine traffic in the Persian Gulf, the Sea of Oman, and the Red Sea if the U.S. blockade of its ports continues. NBC News. So now you have this extraordinary situation. The U.S. says it's enforcing a targeted blockade against Iranian ports specifically, while keeping the strait open for everyone else. Iran says that blockade is a ceasefire violation and threatens to shut the whole thing down again. The result is a corridor that is no longer completely shut down, but far from fully restored, constrained by competing military pressure, political control, and uncertainty at sea. Military.com, American warships, aircraft, and more than 10,000 personnel continued enforcing restrictions on vessels tied to Iranian ports, warning them to turn back or face consequences. 6 vessels had already turned back under U.S. orders. Military.com, Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi posted on X that vessels could transit the strait along coordinated routes during the ceasefire, but U.S. forces continued turning back ships tied to Iranian ports, creating a split reality in the narrow waterway. Military.com, 2 different sets of rules, in the same stretch of water, at the same time. And then there's the detail that doesn't get nearly enough attention. One of the most alarming facts buried inside this entire crisis. According to one report, Iran lost track of mines it planted in the Strait of Hormuz, and is therefore unable to fully open the strait even if it wanted to. Wikipedia. Iran lost track of its own mines in the world's most important shipping lane, in a corridor 21 miles wide where oil tankers the length of skyscrapers pass through every day. There are mines floating somewhere that even the people who put them there cannot fully account for. The U.S. responded by launching mine-clearing operations to secure safe passage. Wikipedia. But mine clearing is painstaking, dangerous, slow work. And every day it takes is another day. 230 tankers sit inside the Gulf, going nowhere. War risk ship insurance premiums for the strait increased from 0.125% to between 0.2% and 0.4% of the ship insurance value per transit. For very large oil tankers, this is an increase of $250,000 per trip. Wikipedia. Every captain who sails through that water right now is making a calculation that no captain should ever have to make. Now let's zoom out and look at the bigger picture. Because while all of this is happening in the Persian Gulf, other parts of the world are watching very carefully and making their own moves. China. Let's talk about China. Trump said China is very happy that I am permanently opening the Strait of Hormuz, adding, I am doing it for them, also, and the world. This situation will never happen again. They have agreed not to send weapons to Iran. President Xi will give me a big fat hug when I get there in a few weeks, NBC News. A Chinese foreign ministry spokesperson said reports it was preparing to deliver air defense systems to Iran were entirely fabricated. NBC News. China is in a uniquely delicate position here. Beijing is one of the largest buyers of Gulf oil. A closed Strait of Hormuz hits China's economy hard. At the same time, China has maintained economic ties with Iran and wants to avoid being seen as taking Washington's side in the conflict. So Beijing is threading a needle, not sending weapons to Iran, not directly helping the US either, but quietly watching and waiting for the moment it can step in diplomatically in a way that benefits China's long-term interests. While U.S. efforts to reopen the Strait of Hormuz were ongoing, China moved to block the Scarborough Shoal in the South China Sea. Wikipedia: 2 choke points, 2 crises simultaneously. That tells you something important about how Beijing views this moment as an opportunity to press its own geographic advantage while American military focus is concentrated in the Middle East. And what about the rest of the world? Opinion polling showed that most Americans opposed the war. The Guardian found 27% of Americans were supportive, while 43% were opposed and 29% were uncertain. Wikipedia. According to the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal, Trump made a reasonable decision to strike Iran after diplomacy failed, arguing that other options would have been much riskier and could have allowed Iran to obtain nuclear weapons, just like North Korea did. Wikipedia. Former CIA analyst Ken Pollack warned that the worst possible outcome could be if the war ended without toppling the Iranian government. Wikipedia. Inside America itself, divided. Half the country questioning why they are in another Middle East war, the other half arguing that Iran's nuclear program had to be stopped before it was too late. Congress arguing about funding. House Speaker Mike Johnson said a supplemental funding request was inevitable. Congress.gov. And Pakistan, the country that has quietly emerged as one of the most important actors in this entire story. Pakistan deployed fighter jets to escort an Iranian delegation home from the Islamabad talks after concerns were raised they could be targeted during their return. About 20 aircraft, including fighter jets and an airborne warning system, were involved in the operation. Iran International Pakistan escorting Iranian diplomats with a fighter jet formation. That's how tense this situation has become. Even the act of flying home from a peace conference required military protection. So let's bring this all the way to today, April 18, 2026. Iran says the Strait of Hormuz is completely open to commercial vessels. But shipping behavior has shifted in confusing and contradictory ways. Some operators resumed transit under tighter controls, while others delayed departures, rerouted cargo, or held vessels outside the strait as they assessed risk. Military.com German shipping company Hapag-Lloyd said it was continuing to avoid the strait while monitoring conditions. Military.com. In-person talks between the U.S. and Iran could resume as early as this week, according to 2 people familiar with the negotiations. Trump said the war was very close to over, while Tehran said messages were still being exchanged via Pakistan. NBC News. And yet, an Iranian cleric said the conflict with the United States would continue in different forms and warned that Iran's forces are ready to respond to any escalation. The war with the U.S. is not something that ends and will take different forms over time, said Mohammad Nabi Mousavi Fard. The smallest mistake by the enemy will be seen as a violation of the ceasefire. Iran International. Both things are true at the same time. Talks might happen this week, and Iran is warning that the smallest mistake means war again. That is the reality of where things stand right now. The peace talks between the United States and Iran ended in Islamabad without a deal to end the now 7-week-old Iran war. Each side blamed the other for the failure. Both capitals, but especially Washington, now face difficult decisions. Council on Foreign Relations. Trump's calculation seems to be that the loss of oil revenue will force Tehran back to the negotiating table, if not to its knees. But the economic pain from the closure of the Gulf will cut both ways. Global oil prices will rise higher the longer the blockade lasts and could possibly send the global economy into a tailspin. Tehran may calculate that international pressure will force Washington to end its blockade before Iran feels any bite. Council on Foreign Relations. That is the chess game being played right now in those 21 miles of water. Who blinks first? Who runs out of economic oxygen first? Whose domestic situation, the protests on the streets of Tehran or the polls in America, breaks first? Nobody knows the answer. Not yet. What we know is this. At least 3 tankers were struck near the strait, including one off Oman that was set ablaze. Wikipedia. What we know is that mines nobody can fully locate are floating somewhere in the world's most critical shipping lane. What we know is that 230 tankers are still sitting inside the Gulf. What we know is that Brent crude is climbing and analysts are warning about $100 per barrel. What we know is that fuel rationing has begun in parts of Asia. What we know is that a ceasefire exists on paper but is being interpreted completely differently by each side. And what we know above all else is this: the Strait of Hormuz has always been described as the world's most important choke point. A geography textbook fact, something you learn about in school. But right now, in April 2026, it is not a fact in a textbook. It is a live military standoff. It is the place where the future of global energy, the survival of Iran's government, the legacy of Trump's second term, the role of Pakistan as a mediator, the calculations of China, and the livelihoods of billions of people who need affordable fuel to live, all of it is colliding at once, in 21 miles of water, and nobody, not the generals, not the diplomats, not the analysts, not Washington, not Tehran, knows exactly how this ends. What we do know is that the world cannot afford for it to stay closed. But knowing that and being able to fix it are 2 very different things. The key to that strait exists. Somewhere in a negotiating room, in a phone call, in a compromise that neither side has been willing to make yet. And until that key is found, those 230 tankers will keep sitting there. Those insurance premiums will keep climbing. Those fuel prices will keep rising. And those American warships and Iranian fast attack boats will keep circling each other in 21 miles of water that the whole world is watching,